The military dog had never once broken formation in 4 years of service. But the moment he saw the ICU nurse walk down the hallway, he sat down, lifted his paw to his brow, and refused to move. Nobody in that hospital understood what they were looking at. Not the handler holding his leash, not the veteran in the wheelchair beside him. Not the nurse herself, who stopped mid-step, her clipboard slipping from her fingers and clattering against the tile floor. For 3 years, Maggie Doyle had worked the night shift at Cedar Point Regional Medical Center, and in 3 years, nobody had asked her a single question about her past. She liked it that way. She wore plain white sneakers, kept her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a low bun, and spoke so softly that new residents sometimes had to lean in to hear her. She was 54 years old. She checked IV lines. She adjusted pillows. She held the hands of dying men at 3 in the morning when their families couldn't make it in time. Nobody knew she used to be someone else entirely. The dog's name was Titan. He was a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois, broad through the chest, with a graying muzzle, and a torn left ear that never quite healed right. He belonged to a program that placed retired combat dogs with wounded veterans for therapeutic support. And today, he had come to Cedar Point walking beside his current handler, a 26-year-old Army veteran named Corporal Daniel Reyes, who had lost both legs above the knee to an IED outside Kandahar 3 years earlier. Daniel wasn't Titan's first handler. Everyone at the VA knew that. Titan had served 2 full combat deployments with a different soldier before Daniel ever met him. Nobody talked about that soldier. His file was sealed. Titan held the salute for 11 full seconds. The hallway went completely silent. A resident physician froze with his hand on a supply cart. An elderly patient, shuffling past with his walker, stopped and stared. And Maggie Doyle stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, staring at a dog she had never met in her life, her face draining of every trace of color. "He's never done that," Daniel said quietly, his voice shaking. "Not once. Not for a general. Not for the base commander. He's never done that for anybody." Maggie didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat had closed around something. She thought she'd buried a long time ago whatever this dog knew, whatever he remembered in that scarred, disciplined body of his. It was about to drag Maggie Doyle's entire past out of the dark and into the fluorescent lights of a hospital hallway where she had spent 3 years trying very hard to disappear. Cedar Point Regional Medical Center sat on the edge of a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everybody thought they knew everybody. The ICU wing was quiet that morning. The low hum of monitors and the soft squeak of rubber shoes on tile, the only sounds that mattered. Maggie liked mornings best. The chaos of the overnight shift had settled. The families hadn't arrived yet to sit in the hallway with their coffee and their fear. She had been walking toward room 214 to check on a post-surgical patient when Titan came around the corner with Daniel and stopped dead in his tracks. The dog didn't growl, he didn't bark. He simply sat, back straight, ears up, and raised one scarred paw to the side of his head in a gesture so deliberate, so clean, that everyone who saw it understood instantly it wasn't an accident. It was a command he had been trained to perform on exactly one occasion for a superior officer. "Titan, heel," Daniel said, tugging gently on the leash. The dog didn't move. His amber eyes stayed locked on Maggie, unblinking, focused with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Daniel's neck stand up. "I don't understand," Daniel murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "He does not do this." A nursing supervisor named Carol Whitfield came jogging around the corner, alerted by a passing aide. She was a heavy-set woman in her 60s who had run the ICU floor for almost 2 decades, and she did not like surprises on her unit. "What is going on here?" Carol demanded, eyeing the dog with open suspicion. Doyle, do you know this animal? Maggie shook her head slowly, though something in her eyes said otherwise. No, she whispered. I've never seen him before. But her hands were trembling. Carol crossed her arms. Then why is he looking at you like that? Nobody had an answer. Daniel tried again, softer this time, using the release word he'd been taught during Titan's transfer paperwork. Nothing worked. The dog remained locked in place, paw raised, eyes fixed on the quiet, grey-haired nurse standing 10 feet away, like she was the only thing left standing in the world he remembered. Maggie finally forced her legs to move. She crouched down slowly, the way you'd approach a frightened child, and held out one open palm. Easy, she whispered. Her voice had changed. It wasn't the soft, careful hospital voice anymore. It carried something underneath it, something flat and steady and used to being obeyed. Titan lowered his paw. He didn't relax. He rose to his feet and walked toward her, each step measured, deliberate, and pressed his scarred head gently against her open hand. A small broken sound escaped him. Not a growl, not a bark, a whine low and mournful, the kind of sound a creature makes when it has been waiting a very long time for something it stopped believing would ever come back. Carol stared. Daniel stared. Even the elderly patient with the walker had stopped to watch, his mouth slightly open. Ma'am, Daniel said carefully, his voice unsteady. I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you know where this dog came from? Maggie kept her palm resting against Titan's head. Her eyes were wet, though she hadn't let a single tear fall. He was trained at Joint Base Lewis McCord, she said quietly, class of 2019. His imprint handler taught him that salute as a private signal. It was never supposed to be used on anyone but her. The hallway went dead silent. Hurt? Carol repeated slowly. Maggie stood up. For the first time in 3 years, she looked directly at the people around her instead of down at a clipboard. Me, she said. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Carol let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Doyle, you check blood pressure and change catheters. You've worked here 3 years, and you've never once mentioned the military. I never mention a lot of things, Maggie said quietly. Daniel was studying her now with a different kind of focus, the same focus soldiers use when they're trying to place a face from an old photograph. What's your last name? He asked. Your real one? Doyle is real, she said. It's my married name. I go by it because it's easier. Easier than what? Maggie hesitated. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steadily, oblivious to the moment unraveling beside it. Easier than being asked questions I'm not allowed to answer, she said finally. Titan sat down beside her, pressing his weight against her leg, the way a much smaller dog might lean against a child for comfort. It was such a gentle, ordinary gesture from an animal that had just performed a military salute in a hospital hallway that it somehow made the whole scene feel even stranger. Carol's expression had shifted from irritation to something closer to unease. Doyle, I need to know what's happening on my floor. Is this dog dangerous? No, Maggie said immediately. He would never hurt anyone in this building. He's protecting me. That's all he's ever known how to do. Protecting you from what? Maggie didn't answer that question. Instead, she looked down at Titan, running her fingers gently along the torn edge of his left ear, the same jagged scar she had bandaged herself once, years ago. In a place she still wasn't permitted to name out loud. He got that in a raid, she said quietly. Shrapnel took part of it clean off. I remember the medic saying he'd never track scent the same way again. He proved every one of us wrong within 6 weeks. Daniel's breath caught. You were his handler. I was, Maggie said, before whatever unit had him after me. I trained him from an 11-month-old pup who couldn't sit still through a 5-minute obedience drill into the dog standing in front of you right now. Then why? Daniel asked slowly. Does nobody know who you are? Maggie's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like she might simply turn and walk away, the way she had turned away from every uncomfortable question for 3 long years. But Titan shifted his weight against her leg again, a small, steady pressure, and something in her seemed to give way. Because 6 years ago, she said, I did something the Navy still hasn't officially acknowledged happened. And the man responsible for burying it walked past me in this very hospital 2 weeks ago, wearing a visitor's badge. Carol's arms uncrossed slowly. What man? Maggie looked toward the far end of the hallway, toward the private wing reserved for high-priority patients, the wing where a retired rear admiral named Walter Grayson had been recovering from cardiac surgery for the past 11 days. That man, she said, to understand what happened next. You have to understand what happened 6 years earlier, in a place that existed only in classified after-action reports, and in the nightmares of the 4 people who survived it. Maggie Doyle had not always been Maggie Doyle. Before the hospital, before the quiet apartment, 2 towns over, before the plain white sneakers, she had been Petty Officer First Class Margaret Hale, a naval special warfare combat medic, embedded with a joint task force operating along the border of a country whose name never appeared in any news report her neighbors would ever read. She had been assigned Titan, then simply designated K94471, as part of a program pairing elite medics with multi-purpose canines, trained to detect explosives and track wounded personnel through hostile terrain. Over 18 months, the 2 of them had walked into more compounds and dragged more wounded men out of more burning buildings than Maggie could count anymore without her hands starting to shake. The mission that ended her career happened on a moonless night in a valley whose coordinates she had memorized so completely. She still saw them sometimes behind her eyelids when she closed her eyes. Her unit had been ambushed while extracting a downed pilot. Rear Admiral Walter Grayson, then a captain, overseeing the operation from a forward command post, had made the call to abort the extraction and pull all support assets back, citing unacceptable risk to remaining personnel. Maggie had refused the order. She had gone back in with Titan, alone, against direct command, and pulled 3 wounded men out of that valley over the course of 4 hours while enemy fire chewed through the darkness around them. She saved every one of them. Titan took a bullet meant for her shoulder and nearly died on the operating table 2 days later. And then, instead of a medal, Maggie had received a quiet, closed-door meeting in which she was informed that her actions, while heroic, had directly contradicted a superior officer's order during an active combat operation. There would be no court-martial. There would also be no record, no recognition, no acknowledgement that the mission had ever gone the way it actually went. Her official file was sealed. She was quietly separated from active duty, under circumstances that would never be explained to anyone, including her own mother, who died 3 years later, still believing her daughter had simply grown tired of the military. Titan had been reassigned. Maggie had never been told where he went. She assumed, in the years since, that he was likely retired to a quiet life somewhere far away from her, and she had made peace, as much peace as a person can make, with never seeing him again. She had taken her medical training and become a civilian nurse. She had built a small, quiet, invisible life, and she had never once, in 6 years, said the name Walter Grayson out loud to another living soul. Until now, Carol Whitfield sat down heavily in a nearby chair, the fight suddenly gone out of her voice. Doyle, are you telling me a decorated Navy officer buried your actions to cover his own decision? I'm telling you, Maggie said carefully, that 3 wounded men are alive today because I disobeyed a direct order, and the man who gave that order has spent 6 years making sure nobody ever finds out he gave it. Daniel had gone very still, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. Ma'am, I need to say something, and I need you to hear all of it. Maggie turned to him. The men you pulled out of that valley, Daniel said slowly, his voice tightening with something between disbelief and grief. Was one of them a helicopter pilot named Ochoa? Maggie's whole body went rigid. Yes. Ochoa was my platoon leader before the crash that took my legs, Daniel said. He talked about that night more than any other night of his entire deployment. He said a medic and a dog came back for him when command told everyone else to leave him. He never knew her name. He said the Navy told him the record was sealed, and he'd get in trouble even asking about it. Titan let out a low huff, as though he too remembered. He's the reason I asked for a K9 partner when I came home, Daniel continued, his eyes wet now. He said if a dog and a medic like that existed once, maybe one existed for me too. I got assigned Titan 8 months ago. I never once made the connection until this exact moment. Maggie pressed a hand over her mouth. 6 years of silence. 6 years of believing that night had disappeared into a file cabinet. Nobody would ever open again. And here it was, standing in front of her in a wheelchair, alive, breathing, telling her that it had mattered. He's alive, she whispered. Ochoa is alive. He's got 3 kids now, Daniel said, smiling through the tears on his face. He named his youngest daughter after a dog he never got the name of. He calls her Titan Grace. His wife thought he was joking. Carol had gone completely silent, one hand pressed over her heart. Maggie sank down beside Titan, wrapping both arms around his thick neck the way she hadn't allowed herself to do in 6 long years, and for a moment, in the middle of a hospital hallway, the quiet ICU nurse, nobody had ever asked a single question about let herself cry. Word travels fast in a small hospital, and it travels even faster when it involves a decorated military dog performing a formal salute in a public hallway. By that afternoon, the story had reached every corner of Cedar Point Regional, and eventually, inevitably, it reached the private recovery wing, where Rear Admiral Walter Grayson, retired, was sitting up in bed reading a newspaper. Maggie hadn't planned to confront him. She had spent 6 years building a life specifically designed to avoid this exact moment. But Daniel wheeled himself down that hallway with a folder full of paperwork Ochoa had quietly kept for years. Unofficial notes, timestamps, a handwritten account he'd never had anywhere official to submit. And he asked Maggie one simple question. Are you going to let this stay buried? Maggie thought about her mother, who died never knowing the truth. She thought about the 3 men she pulled out of that valley, men who existed, who had families now, who were alive because of a choice command had tried to erase. She thought about Titan, 7 years old now, grey around the muzzle, who had never once forgotten who she was even after everyone else had been told she didn't matter. She walked into that room. Grayson looked up from his newspaper and went pale the moment he saw her face. He was 71 years old now, his once broad shoulders thinned by illness, but the recognition in his eyes was instant and unmistakable. Petty Officer Hale, he said quietly. It's Doyle now. Maggie said, but you already knew that too, didn't you? That's why you never came near this floor in 11 days. Grayson set down his newspaper slowly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Titan sat in the doorway beside Daniel's wheelchair, perfectly still, watching. I made a decision that night to protect the maximum number of lives with the information I had, Grayson said finally, his voice quieter than Maggie remembered it, being 6 years earlier. You disobeyed that decision. I saved 3 men that decision would have killed," Maggie said. "And instead of owning that, you buried me. You buried my dog. You buried my name so completely that a decorated pilot spent 6 years afraid to even ask what happened to the woman who saved his life." Grayson's jaw tightened. Something in his face, the practiced authority Maggie remembered from that command tent, had aged into something smaller, something more tired. "It wasn't only my decision to bury the record," he said quietly, "but I never fought it. That much is true. I let it happen because it was easier than admitting my order was wrong." "Easier for who?" Maggie asked. Grayson didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of its old command. "For me," he admitted. "It was easier for me." The room went silent except for the steady beep of his heart monitor. "I'm dying." "Petty Officer Hale," Grayson said quietly. "The surgery bought me time, not a cure, and in 11 days, lying in this bed, I have thought more about that valley than I've allowed myself to think about it in 6 years." Maggie's arms were crossed tight against her chest, but her eyes had softened, just slightly. "I owe you a correction to the record," Grayson said. "I owe those 3 men public acknowledgement of what actually happened. I should have done it 6 years ago. I am asking you now, if you'll let me, to finally do it." The correction took 4 months to move through official channels, but it moved. Grayson, in the final months of his life, submitted a full, signed statement supporting Maggie's actions and formally requesting the record be reopened. Ochoa's handwritten notes, kept quietly for 6 years in a shoebox in his closet, became part of the official file. Daniel testified. So did 2 of the other survivors, men Maggie hadn't seen since the night they were carried out of that valley. The ceremony was held on a cold, clear morning at Cedar Point's small town square, not a military base, because Maggie had asked for it that way. She wanted the people who had spent 3 years walking past her in hospital hallways, without knowing a single thing about her past, to be the ones standing there when the truth finally came out. Carol Whitfield stood in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she pretended not to need. Daniel sat beside her in his chair, Titan lying calmly at his feet, ears alert, watching Maggie the entire time the way he always did now, like he was still standing guard over something precious he'd once believed was lost forever. A young naval officer read the citation aloud, correcting 6 years of silence in front of a crowd of maybe 200 people, half of them hospital staff who had worked beside Maggie Doyle, without ever once suspecting what she carried underneath that quiet, careful voice. When the officer finished reading, he turned to Maggie and asked if she had anything she wanted to say. Maggie looked out at the crowd. She found Ochoa near the back, holding his youngest daughter, the little girl with the dog's name, on his hip. She found Grayson's empty wheelchair near the front, reserved in his honor, though he had passed away 3 weeks earlier, gentler in his final days than Maggie had ever imagined possible. And she found Titan, sitting straight and steady at Daniel's feet, watching her the way he had watched her that very first morning in the hospital hallway. "I didn't do this for recognition," Maggie said finally, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet square. "I did it because 3 men needed to come home, and I had a choice to make. I'd make the same choice again." She paused, looking down at Titan. "But I want to say this for anyone listening who has ever felt forgotten. Somebody remembers. It might not be the person you expect. It might be a dog who never stopped believing you'd come back. But somebody always remembers." Titan rose slowly to his feet, walked across the square without anyone directing him, and sat down in front of Maggie one final time. Then, gently, deliberately, he lifted his scarred paw to the side of his head and held it there. The whole square went completely silent. Maggie knelt down in front of him, returned the gesture with a slow, steady salute of her own, and let the tears fall freely this time, in front of everyone, for the first time in 6 long years. Maggie still works the night shift at Cedar Point Regional. She still wears plain white sneakers and keeps her hair pulled back in a low bun. But these days, when a new resident asks her a question in the hallway, she doesn't just answer softly and look away. Sometimes she tells them about a dog with a torn ear who never forgot her name, even after the whole world tried to make him. If this story reminded you that loyalty never really fades, even after years of silence, consider leaving a like so more people can find stories like this one. If you know someone who loves veterans, working dogs, or stories about the truth finally coming home, share this with them today. We believe the quiet heroes among us deserve to be remembered, not forgotten. If stories like Maggie and Titans mean something to you, we'd be honored to have you join us here at K9 Heroes Uncovered. Have you ever known someone whose sacrifice went unrecognized for far too long? Tell us about them in the comments below.